MMA fans are a lucky bunch. The effective and alleged monopoly of the UFC over the sport means that they have access to the biggest names, most of the best talent, and, won't you look at that, can actually make them compete against each other. However, this isn't always the case, and there are definitely fights that have entered the imaginations of UFC fans everywhere that never quite materialized. John Jones vs Rumble Johnson, DC vs Brock Lesnar, Ngannou vs Jones, Fedor versus anyone, Zabit versus anyone. Seriously though, the Zabit one still stings. And of course, GSP versus Silva. But for UFC fans, there is one fight that has allured us like no other. One white whale for all the Just Bleed brigade. Khabib versus Tony. It's easy to see why Khabib versus Tony remains one of the biggest what could have been matchups in MMA history, even a decade after they were first slated to fight, and with both fighters no longer competing or being competitive at the top of the division. Khabib, by virtue of being an undefeated Sambo Molar from the mountains of Dagestan who wrestled bears as a child, understandably had an air of invincibility throughout his MMA career. Even after his second UFC fight where, depending on who you asked, he lost to Gleison Tibau, there was always a general understanding that Khabib will use his dominant ground game to at least challenge for the lightweight title one day. However, this is where one of the most chaotic figures in MMA history enters, Tony El Kukui Ferguson, figuratively the boogeyman of the division, who went on a 12-fight win streak with 8 of those 12 wins inside the first 2 rounds. Genuinely one of the greatest runs in the sport when you consider how strong the lightweight division was and how brutal the beatdowns of his opponents were. Like seriously, look at the faces of these elite trained fighters after a prime Tony Ferguson fight. So the thinking here was that if anyone could counter the systematic domination of Khabib's game, it was a chaotic cardio machine with wrestling and jiu-jitsu credentials who could take a baseball bat to the chin and win by doctor stoppage because the bat broke. And really, this fight represented everything that made the UFC great. 2 fighters at the top of their division fighting in their prime. Hopefully you can see why fight fans were excited about the fight, and hopefully you can also see why we are traumatized every time it gets brought up. After slating these 2 together 5 times, they entered the octagon together a whopping 0 times. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to chronicle the entire history of Khabib vs Tony, one of the greatest fights to never happen. Khabib vs Tony was first booked to be the co-main event of the Ultimate Fighter 22 finale. Tony, who was 31, was ranked 8th on a 6-fight win streak, coming off a big victory over Josh Thompson. Khabib was ranked 3rd, whose last win was a dominant victory over the current champion Rafael dos Anjos, but had been sidelined for nearly 20 months with a knee injury. There was a moderate amount of hype among hardcore fans for this fight, but at this time, still Khabib nor Tony were too relevant to the casual fan, hence why it was a co-main event on a tough finale card. 6 weeks out from the fight, the 27-year-old Khabib would pull out due to a rib injury. Clearly frustrated after being forced to pull out due to injury after already being sidelined for so long, Khabib took to Instagram, going as far as to say he is not sure if he'll ever come back. Unfortunately for the rest of the division, he ends up coming back. Tony Ferguson would stay on the card facing 6th ranked Edson Barboza, who stepped up on short notice. Tony would put in one of his most iconic victories, submitting Barboza in the 2nd round with his signature Das. The UFC, clearly eager to make this fight happen, rebooked the contest to main event UFC on Fox 19. Even though, not having fought for now essentially 2 years, Khabib was ranked 2nd because, you know, UFC rankings, and Tony was ranked 4th after his win over Barboza. This matchup in terms of anticipation was starting to pick up momentum, spurred on by the notion of this being a potential #1 contenders fight for the winner of Conor McGregor vs Dos Anjos, which was announced just prior. 11 days prior to the fight, it would be Tony Ferguson this time pulling out after fluid was found in his lungs. Tony would release a statement on Twitter which feels weird looking back on because I can actually understand what he is saying, as opposed to the modern day Tony written speak which I'm not fluent in at all. Struggling to find someone to take on Khabib on short notice, the UFC called up the Cage Fury FC lightweight champion Daryl Horcher, who had the pleasantry of making his UFC debut against Khabib. This went about as well as anyone could have imagined, with Khabib earning a TKO victory in the second round. Okay, so we've got a little bit of time here where Khabib and Tony are on similar trajectories, but different paths. Tony Ferguson is slated against Michael Chiesa, who drops out due to injury and replaced by another UFC newcomer, Lando Venata. Unlike Daryl, who kinda got squashed by Khabib, Lando gives Tony a proper challenge, but ultimately succumbs to Tony's signature granite chin, pressure, and Darce choke. Tony would then fight again later that year, finally fighting in his first UFC main event against RDA, who was coming off losing the belt to Eddie Alvarez. In what is arguably Tony's signature performance, he beat the former champion over 5 rounds to earn a 48-47 on all scorecards unanimous decision victory. 1 week after Tony's victory over RDA, we have UFC 205, which will go down as one of the most important events for the UFC lightweight division. In the main event, we have Conor McGregor beating Eddie Alvarez for the belt. However, on the prelims of that card, we have Khabib versus Michael Johnson, in what would, funnily enough, 1 week after Tony's signature performance, turn into one of Khabib's signature performances. Khabib manhandled Johnson for 3 rounds, telling him to give up and how he must fight for the title, all the iconic Khabib lines, before finishing him with a 3rd round Kimura. Khabib would give his now infamous post-fight interview calling out McGregor. After capturing the lightweight title, Conor then decides to go on every side quest ever, including, but not limited to, chasing a boxing match with Floyd Mayweather. While away, UFC decides to make an interim title fight between Khabib and Tony. Surely 3rd time's a charm. Well, we are off to a bad start when Tony goes into a standoff with the UFC over pay, leading to Khabib tweeting that he will pay Tony $200k extra personally for the fight. Okay, this one hurts the most. We were this close to this cursed fight finally happening. It is announced that Khabib and Tony will be the co-main event for UFC 209 for the interim title. Things are looking a go. Both fighters making it to fight week, looking healthy and fine on the embedded vlogs. Wow, that tiramisu looks delicious. Yes, this is foreshadowing. Just 1 day before the fight, Khabib is hospitalized due to weight cutting complications, not even making it to the scale. With no time to find a replacement, Khabib is pulled from the card, but remains cordial with Khabib, wishing him a speedy recovery. That is, until Tony gets word of this clip from the embedded vlog.
How many? 3?
3 tiramisu. This has birutza. This is Russian style. Before it, we eat tiramisu.
This leads to Tony blaming Khabib's weight cutting issues on tiramisu.
I found out too that he was eating tiramisu a couple weeks ago, like on embedded. I'm like, what is this guy doing?
Therefore birthing single-handedly the most uses of the word tiramisu from a single person in human history.
It's tiramisu time!
Khabib denies he actually ate the tiramisu.
Can you clear something up for us, Khabib? People keep saying that you were eating cake, tiramisu, before the fight. Is this true? What's going on here? Why do I keep seeing this?
I don't understand why people talk about this. I don't eat this.
With Conor still absent from the UFC, Tony faces Kevin Lee for the interim title. And sticking to trend for Tony, he survives a slow start to come back strong and win by 3rd round submission, capturing the interim lightweight title and positioning himself for a unification match against Conor McGregor. Later that year, Khabib returns to put a beating on Edson Barboza, claiming that he is the real champion of the division, and even though he hasn't particularly faced the competition to solidify that claim, he certainly feels a future champion if he can stay fit. 4th time baby, Khabib and Tony are slated for the 4th time main eventing UFC 223, as, say it with me now, Conor McGregor is absent from the UFC. Being over a year since McGregor won the belt with 0 title defenses, it is decided that the fight will be for the Undisputed Championship and that McGregor will be stripped. The fact that this fight had been cancelled 3 times prior was integral to the promotion of this fight, and that we finally will get to see the 2 best lightweights on the planet fight it out. Well, let me introduce you to the 2 major villains of this story: sunglasses, especially the variety that is worn indoors, and AV cords. 6 days prior to UFC 223, Tony trips over an AV cord while fulfilling media obligations, tearing a ligament in his knee. Now, did Tony's habit of wearing sunglasses indoors directly lead to this? Who knows, but it definitely didn't help. This, along with being announced on April Fool's Day, yes, really, the UFC was forced to announce the 4th cancellation of one of their most anticipated bouts in history on April Fools, set fans into overdrive as they slowly realized, hey, this isn't a joke. Featherweight champion Max Holloway steps up on short notice but fails to make weight, with the New York Athletic Commission pulling him out prior to weigh-in. After a carousel of opponents, from Anthony Pettis to Paul Felder, ultimately it was Ally Quinter who gets called up on 1 day's notice to face Khabib. Originally on the card to fight prior mentioned Paul Felder, Ally Quinter put up a decent showing, which at this stage was just lasting a full 5 rounds against Khabib, but ultimately Khabib finally becomes undisputed lightweight champion, a belt he will never lose before retiring. 2 years after their last failed matchup, Khabib and Tony are slated to fight in the main event of UFC 249. In the 2 years that passed, Khabib had defended the title twice against Conor McGregor and Dustin Poirier, and Tony has 2 wins over Anthony Pettis and Cowboy Cerrone. There was still no doubt that these were the 2 best in the division. Why this fight ended up being cancelled is messy, but also quite simple. COVID happened, and Khabib was in Eastern Europe. We all had that inkling that this was going to happen, but seriously, did Khabib have to make his formal announcement on April Fool's Day again? The MMA gods laugh at us. Tony would be matched up against Justin Gaethje for the interim title, and this would mark the start of the downfall of El Kukui. Even though there were glimmers of the old Tony, being 36 post-surgery against, at the time, an underrated Gaethje led to one of the biggest beatdowns in UFC history. Hold on, brother, I'm crying. Later that year, Khabib would unify the titles against Justin Gaethje, submitting him in the 2nd round, and to everyone's surprise, announcing that he is retiring from MMA, very much in his competitive prime, citing the passing of his father and the promise made to his mother. This is effectively where the Khabib versus Tony story ends. Khabib would go on to be a successful coach, and as for Tony, hold on, brother, I'm crying.